everyone, and welcome back. This week, I am very excited to get to share with you one of my, now favorite pairs of shoes that I have made. I've started collecting a lot of different antique shoes and boots. Sometimes they're for research purposes, trying to understand construction methods or designs or patterns or shapes. Sometimes I collect them because I just really love them and want to actually reproduce them pretty much precisely so that way I can have a pair of those shoes. And this pair of boots is exactly, frankly, all of those things, as I later found out. The construction methods were very interesting, the patterning was really interesting, the design and the history behind this particular style of boots was fascinating, and frankly, they're just gorgeous, and I am so glad, so glad that I reproduced these because, frankly, I think these might be my favorite pair of shoes now. They were incredibly comfortable. I wore them for a whole week, walking around New York City, doing 5-6 miles a day. They're just so comfortable, and I am really excited to get to share all of the research and all of the process and the wearing of these shoes with everyone. But before I get into that, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video this week, HelloFresh. If you're like me, cooking can often be forgotten amidst a busy work schedule. What are we doing for dinner? Is not the question to be asking at 5 o'clock every night. Instead, HelloFresh means a box of fresh ingredients and creative recipes shows up at my door every week, and I barely have to think about it. Even after a long day of shoemaking, filming, or editing, a great meal is often only 20 minutes away. Each week there's a wide variety of meal options available that I can match to my schedule and my tastes. If I know I'll be busy, I rely on their quick and easy options, some of which only take a few minutes to prepare and require absolutely no cleanup. Not only am I managing to eat healthy and fresh, but I'm learning more about cooking along the way. And there's no trip to the grocery store or leftover ingredients sitting in the fridge. Every week is customized to what I need. I pick what day the box arrives, can easily add or remove a meal, and right now they have all sorts of seasonal extras like pumpkin cinnamon rolls to make the day even more special. Last week I made up the apple ginger crisp, and I would have included footage of that, but we ate it too quickly. And the whole thing is easy to adjust. There are so many choices in the menu, and you can see the meals and adjust the schedule weeks in advance so you can set it and forget about it. So go to HelloFresh.com and use code NicoleR14 to get 14 free meals plus free shipping. It really is the easiest way to balance great food and a busy life. Just go to HelloFresh.com and use code NicoleR14 to get your 14 free meals today. Thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this week's video. Now, this particular pair of boots was an instant purchase for me. The moment I saw them up for sale from Witchy Vintage, I jumped on that because they're just so breathtakingly gorgeous. What I didn't know was that they would come in and be nearly my exact size. They are marked on the inside as a 6.5, I believe a little bit on the wide side, but as you might have seen in my previous video talking about shoe sizes, 6.5 in, say, the 1920s when I knew these shoes were roughly from, isn't necessarily a modern day 6.5 women's US. It translates to probably somewhere around more like a 7.5, or maybe even an 8 or 8.5 during that era. There's sort of a transition of how they're defining sizes at that point. When they came in, they fit me really well, but they're just a little bit on the big side. I decided to use the last that I had previously used for my 19 teens shoes as well as my 1899 shoes because it was very similar toe shape. The transition to a new last shape seems to occur in the early 1920s, but it doesn't cover everything just yet. They seem to be lowering the heel first and then moving into a completely different toe and upper shape. So this particular pair of boots seemed to be at the tail end of that shape, which hinted that it was probably early 1920s. But I didn't have a name for this style yet. I didn't know if it was a really unusual style or if there were other ones that were similar to it that were popular, if it was a big long trend or a very specific one. So I started digging into just looking up boots in the 1920s, trying to find images, references in magazines and catalogs anywhere I could that talked about women's boots. And it showed up really fast. There is a particular style in the early 1920s, more so than other eras. It's not just in that time period as we'll get to, but really peaks in the early 1920s, called Russian boots. Sometimes they are also called Cossack boots. And there was apparently an attempt of renaming them Swish boots because they wanted something that wasn't regional specific, but they seem to mostly be termed Russian boots. Now this is probably because they somewhat reminded somebody at some point of a Russian traditional or military style boot. Interestingly enough, I did find an article where they mentioned talking to a Russian person about them, and that person was like, I guess, maybe. We don't have those over there. That's not a style that came from us, so okay. So it's not so much that it's copied after a specific boot, as much as it seems to be a pull-on style. Something that doesn't have a bunch of fasteners, something that is not fitted around the ankle. There are not buttons or laces in order to undo and get your foot in and then have it be snug around the calf and the ankle. These are loose, very often slouchy in many cases. Sometimes they're made out of fabric rather than leather in the middle part, so it's extra slouchy. But the key factor here is that they are pull-ons. Now, my particular pair does have some straps and buttons across the top of the foot. They're still meant to be pulled on and then those fastened across just that area. They're still pretty slouchy. They have a cuff on top, which is another popular trend of the Russian boot. But there actually was a specific reference that I found that mentioned those, from one company at least, being termed the Tsarina boot when they added the straps and buttons across the top. So they were still defining those as Russian boots, even if they did have some basic fasteners on them. Now, Russian boots came in lots of different styles, lots of different heights, lots of different heels and toe shapes and designs. They sometimes had cutouts, they sometimes had perforations and embroidery, were fabric or were leather, were colorful or were plain, had contrasting leathers and colors, and they just went nuts. Basically, it seemed to be that they were very flashy shoes, which seems to speak to the fact that they were not a super widespread fashionable item. They were very trendy. The references that I found mentioned that they seemed to just explode onto the scene at the beginning of 1922. One particular article said that they appeared at the National Shoe Retailers Association meeting at the beginning of 1922, and everyone just went crazy for them that spring. By the fall, some of the same shoe retailers are saying, oh no, they're totally on their way out. No one wants these. No one's going to stock them. No one's going to buy them. Now, I did continue to find references, at least all the way through 1926, to Russian boots in which they continuously say, oh no, they're totally on the way out. No one actually wants these shoes anymore. No one wears these shoes. Like, only the most trendy, hip people in, like, the cities are wearing these. Like, you gotta be super flashy, and most women don't want that. So if they keep saying that year after year, there's clearly something else there. And there were some mentions that they're actually really hard to make. Though mine do have a seam up the center front that splits open, which allows you to get your foot in more easily. A lot of them are just closed body, meaning that the front portion, which does not have a seam in the center front, will then need to be crimped. This is essentially shaping that piece of leather over a wooden crimping board to get that fold from the top of the foot up the ankle and onto the shin. So that takes one big extra step where you have to wet the leather, put it on a crimping board, and let it dry before you can start the assembly process. And the shoemakers didn't like adding in that extra step. So how much of them saying it was going out of style was just they were hoping it was going out of style is hard to say. But it seems like it was, at least to some extent, around for a good year or possibly a lot longer. And if you look up Russian boots as a term, it does exist before that as a fashionable, more looser fitted style of boot in the 19-teens. It does come back in later. It gets mentioned quite often, but this very specific style of the early 1920s seems to be kind of centered around 1922 and sort of like fades out after that. The wearing of these boots seemed to be the most popular in major cities, not just because they were flashy, but also because they were practical. They were said to have replaced galoshes as the most popular style. Galoshes were particularly popular. Bad weather, living in city life. They are a great rubber shoe, although the versions that were commonly being worn in cities by flappers were apparently buckled galoshes that commonly were not buckled up and then flapped around. It's not where the term flapper comes from, but they do note that it is kind of ironic that flappers are actually like embodying their own terminology by doing that. But these Russian boots and galoshes seem to be coming in popularity as we're turning to more and more shoes for daily wear. When you say look at street images of women walking around in the 1930s versus say the 19-teens, you still see a lot of women wearing boots that go up the leg. They button or they lace or fasten in different ways, so that way they're sort of protecting their entire leg. Great for bad weather, great for walking around cities. By the time we reach the 1930s, more and more women are just wearing shoes. So they have to have alternatives for bad weather, and that's where galoshes and other types of shoe covers come in. And for the early 1920s, that was apparently where the Russian boot really became truly popular. So it's a fascinating style, a super trendy style. That's one of the reasons why, honestly, I haven't seen very many of these in museums. There's just not that many that survive. This particular pair probably survived because it was really special to someone. Not only are they fun and flashy and trendy and really beautiful, but these were worn, like, a lot. They have a lot of wear and tear on the sole, on the heels. They clearly went through quite a few seasons of wear. Whoever had these didn't just wear them for the spring of 1922, they clearly continued wearing them for a good long while, which makes them all the more fascinating and interesting in the fact that they weren't just pretty evening shoes that got worn once or twice. These were everyday shoes. These were heavily loved and heavily worn and really, really appreciated. And I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to not only handle the originals and get to know them so intimately, but to reproduce them and get to wear them and really wear them where they should have been worn to begin with, taking long walks around New York City, because I could not have wished for a better pair of boots for this purpose. They held up to everything and were so incredibly comfortable. My feet were never tired in these. I can see so easily why women in cities in the 1920s picked up on this style and why this particular pair of boots was worn until they practically died. Since the boot and the last that I was using were very similar in size, only about 1/4 of an inch difference in any direction, I took a pattern directly off of the boot. I did make some minor adjustments to the pattern, which I decided by making a sort of mock-up out of fabric. It can also be made out of leather, depending on how serious you need this mock-up to be, but I was able to check the difference in proportions on my last and made some adjustments of about 1/4 of an inch in the back and a few other places. The exterior of the boot is out of a glacé leather, meaning it's kind of like patent leather, but a little bit different process. And this is a leather that I had to special order from England. I'd been using other easier to find versions, but I didn't like them quite as much. This stuff was much easier for me to work with, thankfully. The interior of the original is actually made out of the same leather as the exterior, but because this stuff is a little bit more expensive, a little bit harder for me to get a hold of, I ended up using a plain black leather on the interior instead. All of the accents are done out of a red Moroccan leather, which I already had exactly the right tone of red, so I was able to pull from my stash for that. And then part of the lining is, as per usual, just a cotton twill. All of the leather pieces then need their edges skived, so that way they can be folded over without a lot of bulk, which is honestly my least favorite part of the process. And then the decor was added. I do have a broguing tool, but it is not the right size. These actually were incredibly tiny, tiny holes for broguing, so I had to go through manually and do them all by hand. Then I could start applying the different designs and stitching them down. There is actually such a thing as double-sided sticky tape for shoemaking, which means that I can apply these designs and not have to worry about them moving around a bunch while I do the stitching. I only used a few pieces. I didn't need to anchor it the whole way across, and it can gum up your needle if you put too much of it down, but it is a good way to anchor things. All of these pieces are then top stitched down. The straps that go across have backings of the glacé leather added to them for strength and durability. These are done in separate pieces, so I found it was easier to stitch this down and then trim to match the pieces, rather than trying to cut out separate pieces and keep such thin, narrow bits from shifting around and moving on me while I was trying to stitch. Once all of these pieces are connected, I was then able to start connecting the quarters or the back portion to the front or the vamp. I did make the mistake on the first upper of going ahead and stitching that back seam, because that actually made it pretty difficult to do the rest of the process. If I had a proper sewing machine for making shoe uppers, this wouldn't be as much of an issue. But I definitely did the order of the second shoe differently than the first. So I went ahead and attached that vamp to the quarters before I did that back seam. That made it much, much simpler. Then I was able to assemble the lining the same way without doing up that center back seam, and then attached the lining to the exterior along the opening at center front. At that point, I then went and did the back seam. Interestingly enough, the cuffs are a very simple design, though they're really elegantly made. They have lots of holes punched throughout the red portion that is then backed with the black leather, and then the larger stitching and cutouts are done. This is a very decorative looking design, but it's all done flat, very simple, and interestingly enough is not attached to the shoe until after the whole thing is done. So I went ahead and made the cuffs up, but they then get set to the side to wait for the boot to be finished, because you can't actually get the last out of the boot if you have the cuff on there. So that's actually the very last step that's done to the entire boot. Moving on to construction, I started with the insoles. I did find in previous use of this last that it was actually kind of hard to get a pattern of the flat sole shape off of it using a paper, so I went ahead and trimmed out the insole to match the last precisely while on the last, and then I was able to pop that off, lay it down flat, and get a precise paper pattern off of it. So that made my life a lot easier doing it this way and then using that pattern for the outsole. I skived down the edges so they aren't bulky, and then attached it back onto the last and started the lasting process. Now, because this is a channel style of stitching, everything is done right side out. We are not doing a turn shoe where it has to be done inside out and flipped. So I start off by anchoring the front points, the back points, making sure that everything is nice and even. This is especially important with the fact that this has essentially a toe cap style to it and has all of the seams that need to line up correctly. I need to make sure that everything is properly aligned before I really put in a ton of tacks and get really detailed with everything, so I'm just basically giving it a vague idea of where it needs to sit to make sure it's all lined up correctly. Once I know that it is, I can then pull back just the lining portion and tack that down with a lot more detail around all of the edges, knowing that it is not going to be askew. This has to be done in separate layers because though I am going to be stitching the shoe together, I am also going to be going through the process of cementing or gluing all of the layers together as well. I chose to go with cement for my process simply because that was the easiest thing for me to use. Some of the glues and pastes need either a long time to sit and dry, or they need heat applied, and I wasn't near an outlet to use a heat gun, so for me the cement process is one of the easiest that I can do given that current setup and time constraints. But everything for the lining is very carefully cemented down, all of the bulk is trimmed away by scissors or by knife, and everything is laid out very flat. You want to make sure that you remove all of that extra seam allowance. There's no reason for all of that bulk to be in there. The point of a lot of this work is to make it as thin and flat as possible. At that point I was able to pull the exterior back down since I had pulled it back and out of the way, and I had to start working on putting in the heel cup and the toe cap. These are made out of a very stiff but thin leather that will add a lot of resistance. It's very apparent in the original that they have those pieces. They're really easy to feel for, so I cut out pieces that were similar sized, had pre-shaped them on my last before I started the process, and was working to insert them and cement them into place. Because in the original, it is very apparent that the exterior leather portion is cemented directly to those interfacing pieces. The whole process for me, I played around with how I wanted to do that. I didn't figure out the perfect system because I haven't really worked with the heel cups like this that much before. I'm still trying to decide at what point they get attached, how they get attached. I think I've determined, though, at this point that in the future I'm going to do it with a paste rather than with a cement, so I have the ability to move stuff around and shift rather than have it contact and immediately cement into place. So for future reference, I now know how I want to change my process for this. For the toe cap, it has to be in precisely the right place. You'll see that I dyed a black line at the very edge. Originally, when I cut this out of the white leather and went to put it on, I realized that you were going to actually see through the little broguing holes, and on the original they're black, which means that at the very least a strip of the edge of the toe cap was dyed black because the lining is white. So the toe cap has to be large enough and go back far enough to essentially be the background to those holes, which is one of the reasons why I'm sure this was cemented or glued together in some format, so that way it doesn't shift and move around, and it will always show as a black leather piece behind those open broguing holes. So this part of the process was pretty finicky, and I was making absolutely sure that it lined up correctly. You are able to sort of adjust the cement a little bit even after contact, but if you can get it right on the first try, it makes it so much easier. It also means that at this point it starts to look like a real shoe down at the toe. You get a really nice, good shape. But with all of that inserted and dealt with, I can now move on to lasting and cementing down that exterior leather layer. Once everything was trimmed down, and even for that we have to add in a shank. I've used cardboard shanks, I've used modern metal shanks, I've done lots of different versions, but I decided to go with a leather version for this particular boot. I don't know what is in the original, it's not in bad enough condition that I can see inside, but the weight of it, the thickness of it, and the fact that it was a little bit flexible but fairly strong said to me that it was likely a leather shank that was cemented into place and therefore would hold pretty strongly but still allow the foot a little bit of movement and flexibility. It's not a very long shank, it doesn't go under the ball of the foot, so I shaped out that piece and roughed it up so that way it would actually attach and cement easily into the interior of the shoe, and then cemented that into place. Did a little bit of extra shaping and carving to make sure that it ended up flat and smooth. I don't want ridges or any sort of bumps to show through to the exterior sole, so we have to make sure that that is skived down to be very smooth. The next step I had to do was to get the heels ready because I need to know their placement on the last. These heels I had carved in a previous video, so you can go watch that, but they are essentially enameled rather than covered in leather. There were a lot of different options for this, and probably the original process was what we now call Japanning, and I looked into getting the right products for that. However, the proper product actually has a natural chemical in it, which is akin to poison ivy, which I'm very allergic to, so I cheated and went with the type of enamel that is used on piano keys. It ended up with a fairly similar finish. It's just applied in thin layers. You sand down each layer in between to make sure it's smooth and apply the next layer. I think I ended up with 5 or 6 total layers, which means that if a little bit gets chipped, it's not a big deal. I can always go back in and touch it up later. So it's actually going to be probably, I think, more durable than leather. And then I'm able to take that entire heel and figure out exactly where on the shoe it needs to be placed, which will give me exactly where I need to cut the sole back to, because the sole in this case does not go underneath the heel, it doesn't go up around the heel, it butts up to it, so it needs to be very precisely matched up. The heel is then cemented into place very carefully to make sure that it's not going to shift around, make sure that it covers up all of the little folds from the leather around the heel cup area, and then I can move on to dealing with the sole. Now, the sole does have some special treatment done to it in order to do the stitching that I need to do. This is the first time I've ever done this sort of treatment, so bear with me on this. I'm starting off by simply cutting out the sole to that shape that I took off of the insole. I am rounding out the heel in the back. That's going to be cut away, but it's just easy to not have to guess where that's going to happen. I'm then going around and trimming down the edges so they're a little bit more thin. They had a thicker edge under the ball of the foot than they did under the arch of the foot, which makes sense from the aspect of wear and tear. I then have to carefully go around and cut a horizontal channel, keeping fairly even with the bottom of the sole. I angled it up just a little bit so it's a little bit thicker as you go towards the middle. It's very, very thin at the edge, but I want to, again, prevent it wearing through to the stitches that are going to be hidden inside of this channel. I am not going through with it all and putting holes in yet. That's easier done while everything is connected, so I'm starting off by cementing the sole into place. Again, I could have done this with a glue since it is going to be stitched, but for me the cement was just the easier option. I could also have done the channel after this point once everything was connected, but I found it a little bit easier for me to feel with my fingers exactly how deep I was going and make sure everything came out even and correct. Once the sole is cemented down, I'm going around with a hammer to actually curve down those edges, make sure everything is really flat. I also went ahead and put the heel cap on at this point because it's easier to do now than after I've removed the last, which is something I have to do before I get to the stitching. I could this way get the nails into place, make sure everything was secure, and do it on the last rather than having to put it back on a cobbler's iron. You might notice that I went ahead and blackened the edges of this heel cap. The sole itself will be blackened around the edges, but I'm not doing that until the very end. I then started the arduous process of pulling the last out. You see, the last that I'm using is better suited to shoes than boots, meaning that this was not an easy process. This last should actually be in multiple pieces, but I have been loath to do that until I am sure that the last is what I want and I have the proper equipment to do that. So for right now, this is just a 5-minute ordeal of me trying to yank the last out as carefully as I can, rather than doing things as I'm supposed to be doing them. I can then get to doing all of the stitching, which, like I said, it's a channel shoe, meaning that I go from the exterior through the sole, through all of those uppers, and through the insole, and actually grab the thread from inside. I am not doing the typical shoemaking stitch that I am used to doing here. I am doing the Mackay stitch, which is essentially a chain stitch. And I had mentioned trying to do this on a previous pair of shoes and that it didn't go well because I was trying to use a tambour hook. Well, thankfully for me, I managed to find a Mackay stitch hook, which is meant to go on the machine. So I made some slight adjustments by grinding down the metal so it would fit into an awl half, and I essentially have a Mackay stitching awl now that I can do by hand. So it's just a hook end with a very sharp point, so I'm able to use it as both my awl to punch a hole through and as the hook to grab the thread from the inside, pull it through, and create a loop. Once all that is done, I thought it was a good idea to actually cement this channel closed to make sure that it didn't flip down and end up getting walked on and worn down and walked off. So that was essentially the last step with that part of the process, where I could then hammer it down, make sure it's smooth, pulled out one of my burnishing tools to make sure that everything was smooth and laid flat, and then I could move on to the last few steps of final finishing. It starts off with putting in the insole lining, which is out of the same black leather that I used for the rest of the lining leather, and this just gets carefully-ish cemented into place. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be smooth so it's not caught up underneath my foot. If it goes up over the edge of the other insole a little bit, that's fine. I could then start closing up that top section. So you might have noticed I left that front seam open. That actually gets stitched together and then top stitched through to the lining to finish off that center front, and then I attach the cuff. Now again, this is the point that I really, really, really wish that I had a proper sewing machine for shoe uppers, because this is not something that's really meant to fit on a modern regular sewing machine. My machine can make it through leather just fine, but even with removing the cover and managing to work around the arm of the sewing machine, no matter what I did, what direction, this was a struggle. But I managed it, and finally got the cuff attached, which then gets pulled up and out and flipped back down. The cuff is meant to be folded permanently. It is not a fold up or down option because the black leather doesn't actually go all the way down. It stops before the fold. I then went back in for that very last step of finishing off the edges and a little trim on the sole with burnishing ink, which has a really lovely opacity and shine to it in the end, more so than just dyeing the leather would. Really special to someone, it was worn. Ma'am. More rural areas. Advent. Ma'am. Galoshes that were commonly buckled. Ma'am.